Welcome to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast. I'm Dan Miles. Back on episode 129, I was joined by Scott Erickson for a discussion of the White Album deluxe set. We mentioned at the time we hoped that Abbey Road was going to be getting a similar treatment, and happily that has in fact come to pass. And we're meeting up again to talk about the Beatles' swan song masterpiece, an album so iconic that it led to the renaming of a recording studio, with an album cover so iconic that it created a permanent traffic hazard in the St. John's Wood neighborhood of London. Joining me on the Skype from Danville, Pennsylvania, we have Scott Erickson. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. Nice to be back.
And I'm very pleased to say, also joining us from Clarendon Hills, Illinois, we have an individual who is very well known in Beatles circles, the illustrious Kit O'Toole. Welcome, Kit.
Thank you, Dan. And Scott and I have worked together many times. This is like a reunion.
Yes, Kit is the queen of all social media.
Well, that's a title I don't aspire to, so...
No competition.
For the purpose of this podcast, she will be Her Majesty.
Thank you.
Well, before we dive into, the famous Abbey Road tracks, we need to speak about some other content in this collection that actually wasn't on Abbey Road, but as you just heard, a lot of it will be familiar. The Ballad of John and Yoko, that was John playing, maybe we'll call it a guide vocal, maybe he was trying to do a finished one, but of course there was no bass and no overdubs because Paul was playing the drums. And,
Yep.
How do you feel about that kick drum there, Scott?
Well, unlike the old Hamburg days when Pete Best was on drums, they let Paul keep his kick pedal.
Yeah, it's really noticeable in that raw version that his right foot definitely rushes. But, I think it's good that the Ballad of John and Yoko was like a standalone single. I don't think it's missed by not being on the Abbey Road album. And one thing I like about it is the non-fiction nature of the lyrics. Of course, John will sometimes do what he calls the gobbledygook nonsense songs. This is very much a diary of the actual events. But, I have to say, after the backlash of 1966, We're Bigger Than Jesus incident, John compares himself, or at least he compares his situation, directly to Jesus Christ and the crucifixion. So, do we consider this a ballsy move or a foolhardy move?
I see, your point, and I believe wasn't this banned in some, like there were some stations that wouldn't play it because of the, Christ, it ain't easy. I think it was banned, and so, but I thought it just adds to as you were saying, Dan, the whole story. I mean, how frustrated John was. You can hear it in the lyrics and, of course, in his vocals. Even in this early version, even if, you were saying it could be a guide vocal, that's a damn good guide vocal. I mean, So I would say, I don't think it was foolhardy. I think, ballsy, yes, for sure. I think that's probably, but I'm not, I was never bothered by it. I think it fits the spirit of the song.
He probably figured his true fans wouldn't care, and the people who don't like him wouldn't like it, but so what? And also, it had been 3 years, so it wasn't quite that fresh. But why bring that up again? What do you think, Scott?
I don't think it was ballsy or foolhardy. I think it was just a matter of fact. John was just at this point, he goes, no matter what I do, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
True.
Yep.
I really think that was the case at this point.
And as we said many times with the White Album set, there was a book that came along. So the book for the Abbey Road set indicates that John was well aware before it was released. He was telling people, don't tell anybody what's in this before it comes out, because he wanted people to buy it before, it was like, as Kit said, banned, or it was like, controversial. So he expected that. But a little more unexpected, there was a little bit of backlash when people found out George and Ringo weren't on the track. It was a two-man show. The four Beatles didn't really care at that point in their career. But people thought, well, you're selling a single that says, by the Beatles. George and Ringo weren't on it. It's like the Nurk twins here. That one even surprises me. Even now and probably would have then. It's kind of like, they'd already done the White Album. And I think Ringo had pointed out like half the tracks on the White Album don't have all four of them on it.
By the same token, why would people get upset at that? But Yesterday is credited as a Beatles single. And the only Beatle on it is Paul.
I don't know how that information got out, but it wasn't like a fraudulent kind of thing. And it wasn't even something that Paul and John really did behind anybody's back. George was out of town. Ringo was busy. John was feeling inspired and wanted to rush to do it. And it also speaks highly of his opinion of Paul's drumming, that he told him out the gate, you need to play bass and drums on this. But as Scott mentioned last time, Paul's drumming on Dear Prudence was impressive.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I remember, when I was first getting into the Beatles and I, first heard this, probably on Rarities. I think that's was probably on at the time, that collection. And yeah, I was surprised that it was Paul drumming. And as you just mentioned, Dan, there are other tracks where he did a surprisingly, great job. And it's a different style than Ringo, obviously. But it's still, I mean, he gets the job done, but even just listening to that, early version at the beginning of the show, there were some nice fills he did. And so it, that really surprised me as I said, when I was first getting into them, that it was just the two of them. That was just John and Paul.
I remember Ringo saying once that he said all the other guys can play the drums, but they play in sort of one style.
Yeah.
I think Paul has his pocket that he's comfortable with. And, that's just your classic ding, 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 ding. I mean, any of the three of us might be able to sort of keep up with that. It's not like it was mega challenging. Ringo himself said he didn't mind not being on that song, and he thought the drums sounded fine. It wasn't like it stuck in his craw and he said, I got it. This has got to be a Ringo performance, not a Paul. Because this had happened before. But I love George's comment. He said he didn't mind not being on it because the title was The Ballad of John and Yoko, so he said it was none of his business. He said if it was called John, Yoko, and George, he would have minded, but...
George didn't mind being on it because, well, at that point, John wasn't on any of his stuff.
True.
And that's something I'm sure we're going to get into today.
And of course, in those days, people only kind of knew what they read in the fan magazines and stuff. There wasn't an internet, and some people just really didn't know what was going on. But one thing I definitely want to mention about that is that was the first Beatles UK single that was released in stereo. Before Ballad of John and Yoko, all the singles in the UK were mono.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
And something we ought to point out is the take that's on the new Abbey Road box. The chatter at the beginning is from take 4, but they gave us take 7 on the box.
Yeah, in case anybody missed it, John mentioned to Paul that on the previous take, he started speeding up. So he said, "You were speeding up, Ringo." And so Paul says, "Okay, George." So they call each other George and Ringo. So.
Yeah.
Mal, een string avec kaput mal. Okay. It got a bit faster, Ringo.
Okay, George.
Okay.
A little playfulness, and you can tell that they are having fun here.
I think that's one thing that really comes through in this box set. Just the joy they had of playing together.
Well, I think most fans know that Paul played drums on Ballad of John and Yoko. They may not know he also played drums on Old Brown Shoe. As with The Inner Light and the Lady Madonna single, the B-side of Ballad of John and Yoko was a George Harrison composition. Considering the two tracks that ended up on Abbey Road, which are brilliant, but one's a ballad and one's sort of an acoustic mid-tempo thing, this was George's contemporary rocker. I think it would have fit on Abbey Road if they could have found a place for it. But if you look at the White Album, George had a ballad with While My Guitar Gently Weeps, another ballad with Long, 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 sort of a mid-tempo thing with Piggies, and then Savoy Truffle was his rocker.
I don't know if I consider While My Guitar Gently Weeps a ballad.
You're right, and the actual White Album was sort of like a mid-tempo rocker. That's a good point. That's telling, though, that I've come to associate it more, maybe because I listened to it more, the original super slow, first take.
Right.
Even so, it wasn't anywhere as fast as Savoy Truffle. I hadn't really thought about it before because, Georgia has such a strong presence on Abbey Road, but it would have been more of a parallel, with his ballad, his acoustic tune, and then his rock and roller. So I wouldn't say he was shortchanged, and it wasn't intentional because he usually got one song per side. But he probably liked having a B-side on a single because a lot of people bought that single and probably flipped it over and heard Old Brown Shoe.
It's funny, as we're talking about, here it was the B-side of Ballad of John and Yoko, decent hit. Yet it's really funny. I mean, you talk to particularly more casual fans, obviously hardcore fans know it, but a lot of people don't remember this song. They don't know it, and it's really a shame because I think it's definitely one of George's more underrated tracks, and and I like this version that's on this box set because I like that you can really talking again about how much fun they were having in the studio. George really sounds like his vocals are just so solid, and he sounds like he's enjoying it. I like that his vocal. Really like hearing in this version, by the way, that the vocals are higher in the mix, because in the final version they're a little more muddied, they're a little more buried in the mix, but I really love hearing them front and center. Terrific bass on here too.
And of course we have the big mystery, who is actually playing bass.
Yes, that's the yep. I'm a co-host of another show called Talk More Talk, and this came up. And Scott, you were there. You were taking part in the conversation. That this is the big mystery. Was it Paul? Was it George? Or was it both? Whoever, no matter what, I really just think this is an underrated track, and I'm glad that it's gotten the nice treatment here, and we get to hear another take of it. You hear George's vocals a little more clearly, and so I love it.
Well, let's move on to two other tunes that were written by Beatles but not recorded by Beatles. Apple Records was producing artists. This was a new label, and the Beatles were obviously on it, but they're also producing other artists who needed material, including people like James Taylor, who we'll certainly get to soon, Mary Hopkin, the Ivies, later renamed Badfinger. So we've got a demo of a song called Goodbye, which Paul wrote for Mary Hopkin. Maybe it was in Beatles Anthology, the videos that came out. I seem to remember seeing him working in the studio with her and hearing her version of it. So this kind of reminds me of like a Step Inside Love kind of thing, where Paul was writing a tune for a female singer and then passing it off. So I enjoy it. It's not really something I associate with Abbey Road particularly, but it's a decent song.
Well, the song kind of brings back memories because I think it was on a very early bootleg that I got, and it was when I was first getting into Beatles bootlegs back in I don't know, probably the early 90s, and I think I had a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. So the sound quality wasn't what I'd call stellar, but so it's so nice to have a better version, in this box set. And I hope I don't offend any Mary Hopkin fans out there, because she's great, but I've always preferred this version, particularly when Paul does that part, and I apologize, everybody, my singing is appalling, so so I hope no one will turn this off, but I have to do it when he sings goodbye, 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 whereas Mary Hopkin just says goodbye. I liked Paul's approach better. I like that more rhythmic, repetitive approach. And so I was so glad, and I see what you're saying, Dan, you don't really associate this with Abbey Road necessarily, but I'm so glad that it's here, because I think it's an outstanding demo, and Mary Hopkin did a great job on the final version. She has a lovely voice, but I just have always preferred this one, and it's so nice not to hear it in muffled quality anymore.
Right. I actually think it would have made a strong White Album track. I could have seen it fitting in there.
That's a good point.
Let's get Scott's comments.
I've always liked the song. I've known it from the bootlegs. I think I heard it. It might have been on one of the early, the backtrack bootlegs, and then I think an upgraded version came out on one of the Unsurpassed Masters. But it's nice to have. It's a nice addition, because again, while it's not really associated with the album, it's that era, and it's included for a completeness factor. So it's real nice to have. But again, if you have the bootlegs, the old bootlegs, this is nothing we haven't heard before.
Come and Get It is another one. It was kind of like, well, the Ivies, of course, were signed to Apple, and everybody at Apple thought they were great, but the public wasn't really having it. So they changed their name to Badfinger, and Paul used his connections. The Peter Sellers film, The Magic Christian, that Ringo was in, they wanted Paul to do something on the soundtrack, so he finagled Badfinger to record his song. which seemed to work out well for everybody. Worked out for Paul, definitely worked out for Badfinger, and the film people were probably happy to have a McCartney composition. Sounds to me like sort of a Ringo Starr solo song, meaning, it's very straightforward. It's not really that challenging vocally or conceptually. I don't mean that as a put down. It just seems like sort of something simple, and I could take it or leave it personally. I don't dislike it, but it's not like a Paul highlight to me. Badfinger does a respectable version of it. Apparently, Paul was a little dictatorial. He said, do it exactly like this. Well, can we change this? No. If you want a number one, do it like this. Fairness to Paul. And that's what happened. So
I don't think it was a question of Paul being dictatorial. What I had heard was Badfinger was commissioned to do 3 songs for the movie, and Paul gave him this one and said, trust me, if you do it exactly like this, it's going to be a hit, and you guys do the other 2 songs. He wasn't demanding, saying, you have to do it. He said, if you do it like this, it's going to be a hit. You got to trust me.
But it's interesting, as I just a couple of weeks ago, I was at this conference at the Eastman School of Music, which was celebrating the 50th anniversary of Abbey Road, and one of the presentations talked about Badfinger and specifically Come and Get It, and he did point out, it's fascinating how that Badfinger didn't veer very much from the original demo, and you could say that about Goodbye as well. I mean, Mary Hopkin, except for that one, the chorus, didn't vary from it all that much, and so it was interesting how Paul clearly had specific visions for these singles, and as you said, Scott, he knew these would be hits, and and it, of course, just that's one of his talents, that he really knew how to write a hook.
You would want to listen to him in 1969 if he's giving you advice on how to sell a record or write a song. He was the man. And speaking of Mary Hopkin and hits, I mean, Goodbye made it to number 2 on the UK charts. And the reason it didn't make it to number 1 is because the Beatles' Get Back was sitting there. And, that's probably good for her. You don't really want to show up your boss, oh, I passed you on the charts, Paul,
With a song that I wrote, so
yeah.
I still win.
Exactly. Well, that was a necessary step, but now we're going to dig into Abbey Road. Ever heard of it, anybody? Little known album. You got Michael Jackson Thriller, Eagles' Greatest Hits, Dark Side of the Moon. This is in that same conversation. But one thing you need to do, for old school folks like us, it isn't a problem, but you have to think in terms of side 1 and side 2. It's very important to keep in mind when discussing this album. It doesn't really carry over into the CD streaming generation, but it was a very serious consideration. You've got this album opener, Come Together. And I have quite a bit to say about Come Together, but I will hold my thoughts. We haven't heard from Kit for a moment, so let's go to Kit and have her give her thoughts on Come Together.
Well, first of all, just in general, before I get to this new mix, I mean, it's always been one of my favorites. It's I know this has been discussed to death, but Ringo's drumming is just superb. It's still I mean, there aren't many songs, I don't think, where you could hear just the drums and immediately know, oh, that's Come Together, or that's, you could immediately identify the song. It's that distinctive, a riff that he's doing. And so I, really just admire him. And of course, John's vocals are just incredible. I know a lot of the lyrics are kind of nonsense and so forth, but I think that his vocals are just, he was a masterful rock vocalist, and this just shows it. The remix is interesting. I think Ringo's drums really crackle on this version. You really and Ringo, by the way, I think is a star of this whole set, because I think his drums just sound more. I'm trying to think of how to describe it, but just more well-rounded, warmer. You can really hear how he used, the whole surface of the drum. I mean, you just really hear it in detail. And the rhythm guitar, I think on this version is a little higher in the mix. You can hear some extra, with John yelling, yeah, and, it's just a lot of fun. It gives really shows how this was performed, Yeah, I mean, it just gives you a real sense this is live. They're performing this live. The only thing that's weird, and everybody's been talking about this, is that kind of moan that John does at the end is really buried in this mix. I mean, you can barely hear it, and I'm wonder why Giles Martin chose that. I'm not not quite sure.
I think it's because he used an alternate vocal track for the ending section. So there's a lot of different stuff I noticed right away on the whole album. The drums and bass have more punch and definition.
Yep.
And and songs like Come Together, I put the album on both in headphones and in my car, actually in headphones in my car and in my main stereo. I was just knocked out by the overall punch and definition of the bass and drums.
What do we think about the fact that the two surviving Beatles who are actually hearing the set are the bass player and the drummer?
Well, a friend of mine mentioned, I guess it pays to still be the living Beatles.
I'm not trying to say Giles was catering to them, and I'm not saying they said, "Oh, just make me a little louder." I don't know their involvement in it. Even if it was a direct case of Paul saying, "Scoot my bass up," and Ringo saying, "Make my drum sound good," the end result speaks for itself.
Yeah, I don't think that was the case either, but yeah, certainly it didn't hurt.
Well, there are a couple things we need to speak about beyond the music, the Timothy Leary aspect, but also before we even get to that, John got in a little bit of trouble with this with Chuck Berry, and I want to see if you guys think this is a fair statement, that Chuck Berry is to come together as Roy Orbison is to Please Please Me, by which I mean if you hear the original Please Please Me before it's sped up, you might go, oh, it reminds me of Roy Orbison, but nobody heard that. They just heard what came out. Likewise, I guess when John presented Come Together, Paul was like, yeah, let's make that swampy so it doesn't sound as much like Chuck Berry. The thing is, Chuck Berry references a flat top in the song, but he's referring to a truck. He's driving down the road and he's talking about here comes a flat top. I don't think John when he talks about a flat top, I either think of a hairstyle or like a politician, like a slang word for a politician. And the reason I think that is because the other thing I mentioned, Timothy Leary, who famously was there singing in the chorus of Give Peace a Chance, he wanted to run for governor of California against Ronald Reagan. And his slogan was going to be come together, join the party. John had written Hard Day's Night to a title. They gave him the title first and had to write a song to fit the title. Timothy Leary was probably thinking, write a song that includes the phrase come together, join the party. That isn't exactly what the song ended up being, but that's what got me thinking, I guess, in terms of politicians. Because Timothy Leary had coined the phrase turn on, tune in, drop out, so he felt like he kind of knew what he was doing with the phrases. But just backtracking to what I said, do you think that the Chuck Berry accusation is fair? Because when I listen to You Can't Catch Me, I don't think about come together, except for when he says flat top briefly.
Yes, it uses, shall we say, similar language to Chuck Berry. Yes, but yeah, I don't know if this stands up as a clear-cut case of plagiarism or anything. I have to agree with you, Dan. In fact, as you were saying about what you think of in this context when he said flat top, I thought, yeah, probably when you said hairstyle, that's kind of what I thought, because he follows that up with here come old flat top, he comes grooving up slowly. And he describes it. And so that's what I thought of. And it's a difficult question because, yes, he did borrow that line, but, as you said, when you listen to You Can't Catch Me, you don't automatically, you don't listen to it and immediately say, oh, yeah, this reminds me of Come Together. They're so close. They're really not. Right. Now, maybe an early version was. As you pointed out, Paul suggested making it, as he put it, swampier because it's, he thought maybe it sounded too close. And also I think they just wanted to be a little funkier, Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think it's a bit of a difficult question. I lean toward that I thought that was kind of overblown as to, whether this was really plagiarism or not.
Well, let's throw this into the mix too. Prior to the anthology coming out, John is going shoot, shoot. And then anthology is very clear. They're saying, shoot me. Now, reference to political assassinations. I mean, if he's created a a political kind of undercurrent because of Timothy Leary connection. Is he saying shoot me because you assassinate politicians? And some people think it's a drug reference, but I doubt that because he had an aversion to needles. He didn't want anybody shooting him. So if you factor that in as well, I don't see him singing about cars and catching me and stuff. But
I think it was just a bad coincidence. I mean, but it was an unfortunate mistake. He flat out stole a lyric. Here come old Flat Top. Regardless of the intent, he accidentally stole the lyric, and that's what Morris Levy nailed him on.
My understanding is that they did a settlement where there was a payment, but it wasn't necessarily an admission of guilt kind of thing. It was kind of like, all right, well, what'll make this problem go away? And then this amount of money. But let's return to Shoot Me. He's saying that for a reason. Do we have any theories as to why he was standing there on the microphone saying shoot me over and over again? Do you guys have a theory on that?
You know what? I honestly never thought of it. When I realized what he was saying, I just thought to myself, holy shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you think of his ultimate demise, it has a whole different layer. One
of the other reasons it's hard to tell what he was doing is because the way he's doing it is he's also clapping his hands at the same time, and it was buried in slapback echo. What he's actually doing is shoot me.
Yeah.
And the surround mix, it's really insane. But going back to talking about the remix, just stuff that I noticed right away on this one. Giles found a way to make the drums stereo. So when Ringo does those rolls around the toms, you hear them travel across the stereo field from left to right. The bass is centered. You can really hear the slapback echo on John's vocal and hand claps a little more defined. And it sounds like the rhythm guitars, John and George's guitars, are panned really hard left and right, which is kind of cool. And the vocals on the last verse are double-tracked. And also the orchestral stabs coming in on the last verse, really dramatic.
Boy, can you hear it.
They've always been there. It's just they just make it a little more dramatic now.
Exactly.
I guess I had assumed that was like a volume pedal on a guitar, but the creative use of the orchestra is definitely something we're going to comment on as we go along. Kid had mentioned, Lennon's lyrics on this particular song, and his own description of some of his lyrics was the word I used earlier, gobbledygook. I never would have said that, except I just read the book that came with it, and he said that sometimes. He had his quote-unquote nonsense songs, Dig a Pony, and I think all it was he had music, he had a melody, and he had placeholder lyrics. And sometimes they said, look, we got a session on Tuesday, and if all he had left was like half real lyrics and half placeholders, he came in and left those in there. I think that might have been the case with this, because he gets away. He has so much conviction when he sings that you'll believe anything he says. And here's the proof of that. He's got feet down below his knees. Have you ever met anybody who has feet above their knees?
Deep thoughts.
Dan, can you say that again, but do a Jerry Seinfeld impression?
He's got feet down below his knees.
Who's got feet above their knees?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. But interestingly, when John performed this song in New York City in the early 70s, he mentioned to the audience, I don't know if I'm going to be able to remember these words. He says, I have to stop writing these daft words. I don't know what I'm saying. And interestingly, I've always mentioned John Lennon as a big influence on me as a lyricist personally in my writing, and it's mostly like the double fantasy, latter day kind of stuff. That's why I said made the point about Ballad of John and Yoko being nonfiction. When he's singing songs like Starting Over and Watching the Wheels and Beautiful Boy, you know exactly what he's talking about, and it's autobiographical. And I try and write things like that too. I'm never going to write a thing about the Eggman, and not that I don't love all that stuff.
I think you made a good point, when you asked earlier about what does shoot me mean, that I thought too, that I don't think he was trying to make a statement with that. I think it just rhythmically, it worked, and it was kind of a placeholder, as you said, but it was really meant to, further accent that even the percussion. So and that's true. I think maybe he did that throughout the song, that, as you said, the gobbledygook, as John called it. I mean, it works in terms of the melody, in terms of the rhythm, but yeah, I mean, when you really listen to it, I mean, yeah, he's got feet down below his knees. That means nothing, obviously, but it works. So I think that's probably what he was trying to do, particularly with the shoot me part.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the movement you need is on your shoulder, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I know what that means. You leave that in, I know what it means.
One of the things these box sets and anthologies are showing is how improvisational he was. Because even when they're doing like final takes on things, he's flipping words around just to try different things. He did it on Sexy Sadie, he did it on Glass Onion. Hold you in his armchair till you feel a disease. A lot of the times, one thing that's kind of interesting about lines like that is you sometimes do apply your own meaning to it. You stop and think, well, it must mean something. I'm guessing it means this. And it might not. I know somebody who worked with John had said, like in the New York days, the impression he got in the session was the thing that really mattered to John was what the words actually sounded like as they came out of his mouth. That was his top priority in his vocals. And I think deadlines, as we'll speak about when we get to the medley, we're talking about an era when people were putting out 2 full-length albums a year and singles in between. And the expectation was for a lot of material, especially a cash cow like the Beatles. And it could be that John's sort of gobbledygook style arose from, like what I just said. But sort of my couple closing comments on this for me on this track. I always thought that John was playing those sort of bluesy leads. And, the book credits it to George, which makes sense. But I realized the reason I thought that is because when I saw the Beatlemania show at the Winter Garden Theater in the late 70s, the actor who played John, when they did come together, he was doing the solos. So I'm guessing that cast, that was their best guess. They thought maybe John was doing it. Did you guys ever think that was, did you ever think it was John instead of George, or did you always assume it was George?
I thought it was actually John and George because there's a harmony split where the guitar solo is in harmony. I thought it was John and George on that because I figured by the time I was old enough to realize that the band was not playing this stuff completely live, that there were overdubs, right. I figured it was most likely Paul on the electric piano.
Yeah.
So the solos, if they were doing the solos in the studio overdubbing, it was George and John doing a harmony part.
Well, I don't know if anybody else thinks this, but as much as I love the track, I kind of found it to be an odd choice for an album opener just because it's like mid-tempo. It's not high energy. You think a Taxman opening album. I saw her standing there opening album back in the USSR. They usually go with something real high energy, and they kind of come in, welcome to Abbey Road. That would have set nicely deeper into the album, too. So I'm not saying it's a bad choice. I just find it an interesting choice.
Well, Dan, let me ask you a question. Looking at Abbey Road as a whole, looking at all the tracks on the album as it stands, what would you open it with?
Octopus's Garden.
No way. Ringo opening a Beatles album? Absolutely not. Never going to happen. He was lucky they gave him Good Night to close the White Album.
Plus, Scott, don't forget, you get the added bonus of getting his track out of the way quickly. They would never give a Ringo tune, and they would never make a Ringo tune as an opener. Another thing that by that point they were doing, and this is something I found out within the last 10 years, is in sequencing. But by this point they started pulling singles directly from the albums as well. They weren't doing singles as their own releases. So what record companies would encourage was that the songs that were being pulled as singles would be the first track on side 1 or side 2 of the album. Which segues nicely into something Scott mentioned earlier, which was Something, George's composition, which was a single A-side for the first time. And we might call this George's finest hour in his Beatle career, that after all these years of struggling to get his songs on albums and to get people to come to his sessions and all these things, how about some vindication here? Arguably, on the last Beatles album, the strongest material comes from George.
Absolutely.
Well, it was one of Frank Sinatra's favorite Lennon-McCartney compositions.
George must have really loved that quote because he knew that would stick in Paul's quote.
He loved that. But yeah, I mean, it's almost like it's like a standard now. I mean, it's just a gorgeous ballad, and I really like, as a Billy Preston fan, I'm thrilled that you can hear his organ better in this mix. It's really, for me, added even more to the song. I knew it was there, but you could really hear it. They brought it up in the mix a bit more in this one, and the strings as well. I think it just has a even warmer sound here than it did in the original. Not dramatically, And in fact, I would say that about a number of the remixes on here. They're not as dramatically different as some of the cuts on Sgt. Pepper or the White Album box sets, but there are these, tweaks here and there that do add, even more to the song, and I think Something is a perfect example of that.
One of the big questions a lot of people were asking is, how much could Abbey Road really be improved by remixing? Because this was recorded on 8 tracks. Yes, the Beatles did record this on 8 tracks. However, they still did reduction mixes to add overdubs. They just did fewer reduction mixes. Right. They were still bouncing. And in a lot of cases, the orchestra tracks and stuff were recorded in stereo and then bounced down to mono. Mm-hmm. And on this one, on Something, the orchestra is now in stereo. And it's amazing in stereo.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And furthermore to that, you get a remix of Something, which we've just spoken about. You get another version of the demo, and you also get the isolated strings as a bonus track with nothing but the string arrangement. And, that with the element you just mentioned would really pop, because all you hear is the strings.
Oh, yeah. One of the things, a lot of my notes that I was taking while listening were just things I was hearing in the new mix. And what I noticed on this, like I said, the orchestra was in stereo, the drums were in stereo again. Like I said, I'm not sure how he did it, and I don't want to know, but it was really, really awesome. What I noticed was in the left channel, a rhythm guitar through the Leslie. I heard that really well. I didn't realize it was Billy Preston playing organ. I didn't realize Billy was on these sessions. We'll talk about Billy a couple of songs later.
Yes.
This remix of Something just really opens it up, and like I said, hearing the orchestra in stereo just knocked me out. And the demo is the same. It's the same demo as what came out on Anthology 3, but it's a stereo mix, and we have the piano track included, which was taken out from Anthology. But the Anthology mix of the demo is just the guitar. And to note, we get that extra melody and lyrics that George sings over what ended up where the guitar solo would be.
Right. When we talked about the White Album, I mentioned that, and this is true for all of the writers, but particularly for George, they put an image of the handwritten lyrics. And Paul did this a little bit, and John did a little bit, but George did it almost all the time, where they would cross a word out, but you could still read it, and then they'd replace it with something else. Mm-hmm. And the little bit Scott's talking about, I love that woman of mine, I need her all the time. I'm telling you, that woman don't make me blue. The song benefits from that not being in there, but it's still nice to know that at one point it was there and to see the evidence of it. George mentions in the book that he actually wrote that at EMI on a piano in an empty studio. He didn't write it at home or anything. He slipped off and did it, which is unusual for him. And since we were talking about lyrics earlier, we were talking about Apple artists. Many people have mentioned that James Taylor, who's an Apple artist, had written a song called Something in the Way She Moves. George acknowledges that was his placeholder. But then it just got to a point, and this happens with writers sometimes, it just needed to stay. He couldn't think of anything better, and James Taylor did not care. He was like, no, George, how dare you? You plucked me out of obscurity and made me a star, but how dare you borrow a few words from me? So there was no problem there. What more people, I know some of our, without naming names, some of our fellow Beatle commentators aren't real fond of the line, I don't want to leave her now, I believe, and how? A little bit of a flub there. It works during the context of the song. It rhymes and everything. That's definitely a Sinatra's, I don't know how, like a type of thing you'd hear him say. But it never really bothered me. But if you talk like that in real life, hey, you want to go get some coffee? Oh, and how?
It's still not as bad as, but in this ever-changing world in which we live in.
But one thing I absolutely have to say about Something, as a person who's been a guitar player for so long, I always point to that as a classic example of how to do a guitar solo, because George's solo on Something is perfect. It's composed. It's not just a repeat of the melody. It's just everybody who's heard the song can sing it back note for note. And if people want to be speed demons and show everybody how fast their fingers can move, I go, you know what? Go learn the guitar solo for Something. Off the Beatles. That's how it should be done.
Right, and it's not overdone. That's I think that's a great point. That it's not simple. I mean, it's probably not simple to play. Both of you are professional musicians. I'm not, and so I'm not sure how difficult it is. But it's so tasteful, and it just accents the melody so well. And as you were just saying it, Dan, I was thinking as you said, I could sing it. It's absolutely, it's that distinctive, but it just, as I said, he was just such a tasteful player.
Yeah, that's a great word for it. And he played like a studio guy. He played what the tune needed instead of showing off, and it was his own
Exactly.
tune. So John's first contribution to side one is "Come Together," classic track. George's "Something," classic track. The first time we hear from Paul is track 3. His "Hi Everybody, Welcome to Abbey Road" is Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Well, let's start with Scott this time and then go to Ken.
I can't help but like the song. It's fun. It's so goddamn dark. It's really a nasty little song, but it's so bouncy and fun. I can't help but like it. I mean, there's nothing bad about the song. I think the only reason John grew to hate it so much is because Paul just made them work and work and work on it until he was happy with it. And then when they thought he was happy with it, he goes, "I want to try it again."
Yeah.
And John hated to linger on stuff. He wanted to get in, get out, and get it over with. But Maxwell, I think it's a fun song. And what I really want to point out here is the bass playing on this track. And it ain't Paul. George Harrison is doing an amazing job of playing a Paul McCartney bass line. Mm-hmm. That's George Harrison playing bass on Maxwell's Silver Hammer because McCartney is on piano.
And the chord changes aren't exactly like Ballad of John and Yoko, where it kind of plays itself and there's only 3 or 4 chords. It's more looks almost sort of classical feel. Yeah,
it's a very interesting. It's a fun song. It's relatively complex chord changes, but if you listen to the bass line, George isn't just playing root notes either. He's doing some little walking parts. He's playing little fills, and George is doing a really kick-ass little bass line in there.
But interestingly, that's the song they were working on when George quit the band, January 1969. So,
yes, but he didn't quit the band over that song.
Right.
So yeah, I mean it's just as I said, just a fun little ditty about a serial killer. I mean that's what it is. It's not. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorites of Paul's compositions, but as Scott said, there's sort of a off-kilter charm about it. I don't know how else to put it. I love the backing vocals, the harmonies on it. I mean, I think even the book that comes with the box set talks about it being, humorous, and they kind of are, because here's Paul, singing about, bang, bang, Maxwell Silver, and it comes down upon her head, and then do-do-do-do-do, I mean, it is funny.
Well, one thing that really jumps out is the prominent appearance of the synthesizer.
Yes.
This was not a sound that people were very familiar with at the time because it was a brand new instrument, and that's almost more significant than the fact that it's a Paul composition, the way it comes in with the big chords and then the way it comes in with the ribbon solo later. And by ribbon, I mean instead of playing keys, you're running your finger along a ribbon. Synthesizers used to have that. The idea of happy music supporting dark lyrics comes up on this show a lot. Interesting thing for me about this, when I first heard him going, "I must not be so, oh, oh, oh." When I was a kid, when I heard it, I thought that oh was a stand-in for a word. He must not be so something. And instead of saying the word, he was just going, oh, and I was supposed to figure out what it was. Now I realize, the judge does not agree and tells them so, oh. It's just like a verbal affectation where the melody continues. But interestingly, in the notes, it originally said, "I must not be so, no, no, no." But then I think the reason he ultimately crossed it out was as the song goes along, painting testimonial pictures, no, 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 and the judge does not agree, he tells him so, no, no, no. Can't keep using no, so I think he just switched it to oh.
Right.
But, he's got some great wordplay, rhyming 31 and dirty one, and that kind of thing. In fact, it might have come from his pronunciation of Joan, own. He's got some extra syllables in there. Paul's comment was the meaning of the song for him. And where have we heard this phrase before? Instant karma. He didn't use that phrase. And of course there's all the thing about John writing Child of Nature, Paul doing Mother Nature's Son, John writing Strawberry Fields, Paul doing Penny Lane. It's almost like this is his instant karma. Of course it precedes instant karma. But, it's like, things are going great and something bad happens. And he's personified it as this kid with a hammer, which is kind of an odd choice. And of course, we learned from anthology, they originally said writing 50 lines. And writing 50 times is better. And this is what I meant about Paul and I'm sure George and John. When you sing the song out loud, what makes literal sense on the paper, 50 lines makes sense. You think of Bart Simpson writing on the chalkboard.
Yes.
But 50 times sounds better when you sing it, They're lucky they changed it to 50 times, because 50 lines they might have got accused of yet another drug reference. 50 lines of what?
I will just say I think the Moog is a lot more prominent on the remix.
Absolutely. That's something that jumped out at me too. And you really, I think, Dan, you mentioned this a little bit before, but the Moog is such a presence on this album, but I think this remix brings it out a lot more. I think there were times where it was there, but it was subtle, a little more subtle on some tracks, and this mix really demonstrates what a crucial instrument that was to Abbey Road.
And if I'm not mistaken, my understanding is the highest seller in their catalog has always been Abbey Road. And I wonder if the fact that the synth is on it makes it feel more modern to later listening audiences. It's hard to know because they use it very subtly. It could just be that it's the highest seller because it's a great collection of songs. As we transition to a second Paul in a row, which is interesting, which will be Oh Darling. I know Kid is something of an expert on this track, so...
Yeah, I did a presentation at this Abbey Road conference that I mentioned earlier about the origins of Oh Darling, and it really has its origins in something called swamp pop. They were records that came out of primarily Southeast Louisiana, and it was the group of musicians that grew up on either Cajun or Creole or a bit of both music, but they also grew up not only on their parents' music but on R&B, and other influences, and early rock, Fats Domino, of course, being a major influence. So they started creating their own kind of music, and probably one of the best known swamp pop records is Sea of Love. Everybody knows that one by Phil Phillips, and it's got this. It's more, and by the way, it's not the same as swamp rock. That's those two are kind of sometimes used as synonyms. Swamp rock is more Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Right.
Which is kind of funny because they were from California, as far away from the swamp as you could get.
Right.
Exactly, and it's really funny because I found this out when I was doing this research. I mean, they're used interchangeably, and they're not. They're different.
Sea of Love just sounded to me like it was like a rhythm and blues number with a doo-wop backing vocal.
There is some of that as well, but you also get some of the call and response. You get sometimes you get accordion in there, of course, not on that record, but on some others. And one of them, if you're inclined to look into this, there's a record called Matilda by, I swear this is the name of the group, Cookie and the Cupcakes.
Yep.
and that is the swamp pop anthem. So if you want to get a really good idea of what the typical record sounded like, go find that. The one thing, though, that's key, and this is where Oh Darling really comes in, is I found with the lyrics with swamp pop, the more miserable and emotional the lyrics are, the better. That was the main thing. I mean, it was lyrics of "you ripped my heart out and tore it in two and stomped on it." I mean, it was just and deliver them as emotionally as you can. So, Oh Darling fits that Because he's saying, if you leave me, I'll break down and cry. And, it's really in that tradition. And Swamp Pop did make its way to the UK. Some of these records were released there, and the Beatles were very aware of them. And they talked about it. And in my research, I found out they talked to John Fred of John Fred and the Playboys. So their biggest hit was Judy in Disguise. But they were a swamp pop band before that. And John Fred ended up going to London in the late 60s, met the Beatles, and they mentioned Matilda. They mentioned a couple of other records that John Fred couldn't believe that the Beatles had actually come across. He thought these were local records. So, Oh Darling is really, Paul's take on this genre. It's a little more harder rock than a traditional swamp pop record would be, which is, be more R&B. But the lyrics, the emotional performance, that's all absolutely consistent with it.
Let me ask you this. Do you think it would be more appropriate on the Let It Be album? Because that was my thought when I heard it. I mean, it's a fine song, but I mean, the other stuff on Abbey Road is so much different, and the other stuff on Let It Be seems more similar. In fact, on the anthology version, they've got the one where Paul and John are sort of singing together. Billy Preston's on electric piano. It's a little more relaxed. It's a different approach, a different take, where this one on Abbey Road seems more like a solo performance, really. In fact, in the written lyrics that are printed in the book, it looked like Paul had actually planned a talking verse, like, I wonder if you're lonesome tonight. And like a very 50s sort of thing where you just start talking and you ended up doing it.
And Swamp Pop does that too.
Oh, darling.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
When you burnt that toast the other morning.
You're right. But don't you think if they would have done that on Let It Be, it would have fit?
Boy, I mean, I see your point that it would, have worked on Let It Be, but I don't know. I mean, I think it's in the right place because it is still an album about, I mean, it's obviously very different than Sgt. Pepper Magical Mystery Tour. It's, even though it's a little more, quote, slickly produced, it's still getting back to their rock and roll roots, in many ways. And Oh Darling is kind of the ultimate example of that. It's a, nod to their past influences. I see your point because it's a little bit, like I guess I could see it along Get Back or, but I don't know. I guess maybe it's just because I'm so used to it being on Abbey Road, but I just see it as, it's a nod to their, early rock and R&B influences. And so for me, the track works on Abbey Road.
Yeah, it's just a thought. It's too late to do anything about it now. It's certainly not a problem. But let me also run this by you. John liked the song and expressed a desire to sing it. He felt he was a better choice to be the lead singer on it. He instantly conceded since Paul had written it. Paul was never going to say, sure, you can sing my song. It wasn't a, writing a tune for Ringo type situation. But imagine if John was the lead vocalist instead of Paul. I mean, how does that sit with you?
I think Paul absolutely knocked this out of the park. I really, if you go on, and I'm sure many listeners have, but if you go on YouTube, I don't know if it's still there, but somebody isolated his vocals. And you can really hear, and he worked very hard at it. Maybe John wouldn't have had to work as hard, at getting his voice to that level as Paul did. I mean, he rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed, and we hear a bit of that on this box set. But I don't know. I think Paul, really did a great job of emphasizing the R&B aspects, kind of like he did with Lady Madonna, and, pulled out the emotion that was necessary. John could have done, I'm not saying John couldn't have done it. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I just think Paul nailed it.
John could never have sung the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
No way.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Maybe if they dropped the key down to like somewhere where Ringo could do it, then John could sing the bridge. But I mean, as great a singer, as great a rock singer as John was, there is no way John could have done that. When you told me, no way. I just don't see it at all.
I think John was just trying to say it seemed like a song more suited to his style. I think he almost kind of wished he had written it. I think he was kind of a little envious. He heard the tune and goes, I'd like to sing that. It wasn't like he ran a campaign or anything about it. He knew he couldn't. But it's an interesting thought. And you get a flavor of it from Anthology when they're kind of singing it together. You can tell John likes it. He's very participatory.
But as far as, Dan, what you said about going back, maybe putting it on Let It Be. Yeah, we know it was originally brought in during the January '69 stuff, right. and that's where that anthology version came from. And maybe a version with John singing the verses and Paul singing the middle eight would have been kind of cool. That would have been really interesting.
My main point is that Paul presented it at a time when they wanted material that they could play live without overdubbing, and he felt "Oh Darling" fit that bill, and I think it fits that bill more than anything else on Abbey Road. That's all I'm saying.
Oh yeah, it does.
Yeah.
But I think as a finished product, I think the finished product with the overdubbing works better than it would have as a 4-piece band playing it live, especially with the backing vocals. Especially when you really hear those backing vocals on the remix. I don't think they could have pulled it off with as much conviction. And once again, another amazing bass part from George.
Mm-hmm.
Well, interestingly, in the book, the giant photo that accompanies the section on "Oh Darling" is George holding the bass. So I think they're with you. And now I hate to be the guy, and I'm not usually this guy. I hate to be the English teacher.
Uh-oh.
But this song is employing a double negative. "I'll never do you no harm" is actually telling someone you will always do them some harm.
Appalling grammar. Yes, that is true. But again, I hate to, keep coming back to this, but that's a swamp pop thing. I mean, it really is that added emotion. And by the way, that you mentioned an outtake where Paul and John are singing it together. You can really tell in that how John was definitely aware of this genre, because when, Paul's singing lines, he says, "When you told me you never leave me," and, that is right out of like a spoken part of one of those records. So people listening, if you go on Amazon, you can find there are a couple of collections of swamp pop, hits, and check them out, because when you hear them, you'll really hear the origins of "Oh Darling," and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I will never not do that.
We could do a whole show on Paul's bad grammar.
That's right.
But it fits this. I mean, the lyrics of a song are not supposed to be the King's English or whatever. It's supposed to fit the mood. And when you separate lyrics out, it's not fair, because a big part of recording is an audio presentation. I was never offended by it. I was never, "Oh, now Paul, you're not using correct grammar." I just thought I'd mention it.